"Don't you want to sample the coffee I prepared just for you, darling?" my husband Brian inquired, with a peculiar smile that never quite reached his eyes. I was seated at my sister-in-law Sophia's tastefully decorated dining room in her downtown Nashville residence, where our family congregated every month for brunch. The coffee mug before me exuded an unusual, almost metallic odor that churned my stomach. My name is Megan Carter, and at 29, I never fathomed I would one day be doubting whether my own spouse intended to poison me. Yet, after 3 years of marriage and innumerable episodes of inadvertent foodborne mishaps, I had grown wary, especially in Sophia's presence. She had an uncanny knack for engineering circumstances that left me either ill or embarrassed, always accompanied by that same seemingly innocent smile Brian wore. "How sweet of you," I managed to reply, forcing a grin while my thoughts raced. The scent emanating from the mug was nothing like any coffee I'd encountered before. It evoked memories of last month when I ended up at the emergency clinic after sipping tea at Sophia's home. The physicians had been baffled by my symptoms, and Sophia had adamantly maintained that she'd prepared the tea exactly the same way she brewed her own. I recalled how she had observed me intently from across the table while absent-mindedly stirring her untouched cup. "Brian's become quite the barista these days," she had remarked with a wry smirk. "He's been experimenting with various brewing techniques solely for you." The emphasis in her tone sent a shiver down my spine. I had also noted Brian spending increasing amounts of time at Sophia's place recently, insisting they were orchestrating a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. But something was amiss. The hushed exchanges that abruptly ceased when I entered the room. The cryptic text messages glimpsed on his phone, and now this coffee with its odd aroma. I raised the mug, pretending to sip while scrutinizing their expressions. Brian and Sophia exchanged a fleeting look that confirmed my suspicions. Pretending to check my phone, I abruptly stood up. "Oh, would you look at that? I need to make a quick work call. Sophia, would it be all right if I use your study?" As I passed by the meticulously arranged table setting, I intentionally stumbled, swapping our coffee cups amid the commotion of regaining my balance. "I'm so sorry," I exclaimed, straightening myself. "I'm such a klutz." Sophia merely waved off my apology with a strained smile. "Just try not to break anything in the study." I nodded hurriedly and moved away, my heart pounding as I peeked through the study doorway. I could still see them at the table, and all I could do now was wait and observe. From my vantage point, I watched as Sophia lifted her mug to her lips, and my stomach tightened with anxiety. A part of me yearned to intervene and alert her, but I had to uncover the truth first. I'd spent too many nights doubled over in agony in the emergency room following shared meals with them. Things hadn't always been this way. When I first met Brian at a friend's wedding in Nashville 3 years ago, he had been charming and attentive, and Sophia had seemed warm and welcoming, inviting me to family celebrations and even offering to help plan our wedding. In hindsight, I should have noticed the red flags, the way she would accidentally spill something on my dress at significant events, or how my food invariably seemed over-seasoned when she assisted in cooking. At first, it began with minor incidents, an upset stomach here, a mild allergic reaction there, while Brian always had a ready excuse. "Maybe it was something you ate earlier," or "perhaps you're coming down with something." But the pattern was growing unmistakable. The most alarming incident occurred 2 months ago, when I was hospitalized after breakfast at their home. The doctors discovered traces of an unidentified substance in my system. Yet Brian had persuaded everyone that I must have ingested some expired medication. I clutched the doorframe as I watched Sophia take another sip of her coffee, while Brian casually typed on his phone, seemingly indifferent. My own untouched mug sat, growing cold, on the table where I'd left it, the metallic odor still clinging to my nostrils, making me shudder. A slight tremor in Sophia's hand caught my attention. She set down the cup, her face suddenly drained of color. "Brian," she murmured, voice trembling. "Something's wrong." Brian looked up, his expression shifting from puzzlement to sheer terror as he realized which mug she was drinking from. In an instant, he leapt up, toppling his chair. "Sophia, what did you put in that coffee?" I emerged from the study, my phone already recording. Brian hurried to Sophia's side, his face ashen, That wasn't supposed to be your cup, he whispered. Yet in the quiet of the dining room, his words resonated clearly. Sophia's eyes widened in realization and fear. "Call an ambulance," she gasped as she slid toward the floor. "Please, I can't." I immediately dialed 911, my hands steady despite the chaos unfolding before me. Sophia was now on the floor, her body convulsing with violent tremors, while Brian knelt beside her, panic etched across his face as he grasped the gravity of their scheme unraveling. "Emergency services. We need an ambulance at 2763 Parkwood Drive," I stated crisply, keeping my phone recording with my other hand. "My sister-in-law appears to be having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious, but experiencing tremors." While I relayed the information to the dispatcher, Sophia's eyes met mine, the usual cool, calculating glint replaced by raw terror. "Megan, you switched. You knew," she gasped. "Ma'am, the ambulance is on its way," the dispatcher assured. "Please stay on the line." Brian's anxiety escalated by the second. "Sophia, what's happening? That wasn't supposed to… it wasn't meant for…" he stuttered. But Sophia cut him off through gritted teeth. "Shut up, Brian. This is all your fault. You said it would merely make her ill enough to miss the quarterly board meeting next week. You promised it wouldn't show up in the tests." My blood turned to ice at the mention of that board meeting, the one where I was slated to unveil my proposal for a major client account, the same account that Sophia had long coveted for her competing firm. Gradually, every piece began to click into place. The tea incident last month, the breakfast episode 2 months ago. None were mere accidents, were they? Sophia's face contorted with fresh pain as she retorted, "The tea was meant to keep you home during the Watson contract presentation, but you went anyway," clutching her stomach as she doubled over. Brian interjected, "We only needed to discredit you, to make clients think you were unreliable." Outside, the wail of sirens crescendoed. Brian rose, retreating from both of us. "Sophia, stop talking. You don't understand what you're saying. I know exactly what you're doing," he insisted. "We've been planning this for months, ever since Megan began outshining me at every client meeting. You were supposed to ensure she drank it today," he declared. Before I could respond, paramedics burst in through the front door. I stepped aside, letting them work as they carefully transferred Sophia onto a stretcher. I halted my recording and sent the video to my private email, then forwarded it to my attorney. Brian stood frozen, watching as his meticulously devised plan disintegrated before his eyes. "I'll ride with her to the hospital," I stated firmly to the paramedics. After all, I needed to ensure my sister-in-law received proper treatment. Brian's terrified glare met mine, and I knew the doctors would be keen to determine exactly what had been in that coffee. At Nashville General Medical Center, chaos reigned in the emergency room as doctors scrambled to treat Sophia. I sat in the waiting area, clutching my phone and replaying the recording of her confession, the quiver in her voice, the panic in her eyes. It was all the evidence I needed to prove that my suspicions were not mere paranoia. "Family of Sophia Anderson," a nurse called out. I stood, noticing Brian's conspicuous absence. He had mumbled something about retrieving his car from the parking lot 20 minutes earlier and had not returned. "I'm her sister-in-law," I explained, as I followed the nurse through the double doors. "How is she?" I asked anxiously. "She's stabilized for now, but we've detected worrisome levels of toxins in her bloodstream." The nurse's grim expression said it all. "The doctor would like to speak with you about some peculiar findings in her blood work." Dr. Collins, a tall woman with silvering hair and keen eyes, awaited me by Sophia's room. "Mrs. Carter, could you recount exactly what happened before your sister-in-law fell ill?" she inquired. I took a deep breath and produced my phone. "I think you should listen to this first." I played the brunch recording, watching as Dr. Collins's look of professional concern shifted to one of alarm. "This is extremely serious," she murmured, scribbling notes on her tablet. "The substance we've identified isn't something that would accidentally find its way into coffee. We're dealing with deliberate contamination." Just then, Brian emerged from the corridor, his face pale and damp with sweat. He had clearly overheard the doctor's remarks. "Megan," he began, taking a tentative step toward me. "Let me explain." "Step back," Dr. Collins cautioned, pressing the nurse call button. "Security to room 412, please." Brian raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "This is all a misunderstanding," he insisted weakly. Sophia appeared confused, barely able to string together her words. I then pulled up text messages I had secretly forwarded from Brian's phone last week, the ones discussing his plans with Sophia to render me out of commission before the Watson presentation. "So these messages between you two were nothing more than casual conversation?" Brian demanded, his face paling. "You snooped through my phone after discovering that odd item in your desk drawer," I replied firmly. "Yes, I did," he admitted. I turned back to Dr. Collins. "Doctor, I've been hospitalized 3 times in the last 6 months with inexplicable symptoms. I'd like to know if they match what you found in Sophia's system today." Her eyes narrowed. "We'll need to run further tests for a proper comparison. Security will ensure your husband remains available for questioning." 2 security officers promptly arrived, flanking Brian. "We were only trying to help you," he stammered, his carefully crafted facade crumbling. "You were overworked and taking on all the major accounts," Sophia interjected evenly. "If only we could make you take a break by ensuring you fell ill. I mean, by poisoning you." My hands trembled with fury as I demanded, "How long have you been doing this?" "Was it you who tampered with my food at the Christmas party too?" Brian's silence answered for him. Behind him, I could see through the glass where Sophia lay attached to various monitors. Her earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by the dread of finally being exposed for our collusion. "Detective Ramirez will be here shortly," Dr. Collins said quietly. "She'll want to record statements from everyone involved." I nodded, feeling a strange calm wash over me. The truth was finally surfacing, and there was no turning back. Within the hour, Detective Ramirez arrived, her presence commanding in the sterile hospital corridor. A seasoned investigator specializing in domestic crimes. She listened intently as I played the recording from brunch and presented the incriminating text messages. "Mrs. Carter," she said, reviewing her notes, "you mentioned prior hospitalizations. Can you recount those incidents?" I pulled out my phone once more, opening a document I had meticulously maintained over the past few months. The first occurred in February after dinner at Sophia's. I experienced severe stomach cramps and dizziness. The second was in April, the tea incident, and then in June after breakfast with them. My voice remained measured as I recounted each event, noting that while the symptoms were similar, they varied enough that doctors could never pinpoint the cause. The detective's gaze sharpened as she scanned my detailed log of dates, symptoms, and circumstances. "You've been keeping records ever since you noticed a pattern?" she queried. I hesitated before adding, "I also started carrying a backup phone with a different number to record conversations when I was around them. I have several recordings of Sophia and Brian discussing their plans, although they were careful not to be overt. In one, Sophia's voice is clear. 'The Watson account is worth millions, Brian. We can't let her ruin everything. Just stick to the plan. A few days of illness should suffice.' Brian's reply was equally damning. 'I've got something stronger this time. She won't make it to the presentation.' Detective Ramirez's expression hardened as she listened. Through the window of Sophia's room, I could see her now awake, looking considerably less confident than at brunch. "The hospital is conducting toxicology screens," the detective informed me. "Dr. Collins has already identified several substances that are not naturally occurring. We'll need samples from your home as well." A commotion in the hallway drew our attention. Brian was engaged in a heated argument with the security guards, his voice rising in desperation. "I need to speak with my wife," he shouted. "Megan, please! You don't understand. We were trying to protect you." Detective Ramirez stepped in between us. "Mr. Carter, you're only harming your case. We've uncovered evidence of premeditation." Brian scoffed hollowly, his voice echoing in the corridor. "We were merely trying to slow her down. She was overburdening herself with all those major accounts." Sophia then stated coldly, "You were meant to make her take time off by poisoning her." Detective Ramirez's tone turned razor sharp. That is not protection, Mr. Carter. That is attempted murder. Explain to me, what exactly did you intend when you tampered with my coffee this morning? Brian's silence was more telling than words. Behind him, I could glimpse Sophia, watching from her hospital room window with a mask of terror and calculation, as if trying to devise a spin to explain away months of systematic poisoning as some misguided effort to help me. We'll need to confiscate both of your phones, Detective Ramirez instructed the security team, and station officers at every exit until we have the full toxicology results. Dr. Collins re-entered Sophia's room, tablet in hand, her expression grave as she reviewed the latest test results. Detective Ramirez and I trailed behind while Brian remained with the guards. Sophia attempted to sit up straighter in her bed, but the tremors had not entirely subsided. The toxicology report reveals elevated levels of several compounds, Dr. Collins announced clinically. Most concerning is a specific substance typically reserved for pharmaceutical research. It's not something available to the general public. Sophia's face blanched. That can't be, she stammered. Brian insisted it was merely a substance to induce mild symptoms. Mild symptoms? Detective Ramirez interrupted sharply as she jotted down notes reminiscent of the symptoms Sophia had exhibited over the past 6 months. The door creaked open, and another detective entered, holding an evidence bag. We recovered these from Mr. Carter's office desk at the Andrews marketing firm, she explained. He reported finding several small vials with clinical labels and detailed dosage notes along with reaction logs. My knees weakened as I absorbed the magnitude of their plan. You were meticulously documenting everything, as if conducting an experiment, I whispered. That's not what we agreed on, Sophia protested weakly. We only needed to determine what worked. The initial attempts were too subtle, and you kept landing major meetings. So you escalated the dosages, Detective Ramirez concluded. Were you aware these substances could be fatal in higher concentrations? An eerie silence fell over the room. Through the window in the hallway, I saw Brian slump into a chair, head in his hands. The Watson account, I murmured slowly, the pieces aligning in my mind. It wasn't just about that presentation, was it? You needed me eliminated permanently because the client specifically demanded me as their lead. Sophia's face twisted with a mix of fury and despair. You were ruining everything I built, my client portfolio of years, and then you appear, and suddenly everyone prefers you, Brian confessed, his tone bitter. I could solve it, he added, by killing you. Those words hung heavily between us. Before Sophia could speak, Dr. Collins interrupted. The concentration of the compound in the coffee you drank this morning, she stated, locking eyes with Sophia, was significantly higher than previous samples from Mrs. Carter's hospital visits. Had you consumed it, the result would have been catastrophic, perhaps fatal. Detective Ramirez then addressed an officer. We need a full warrant for both their residences and offices, and contact the pharmaceutical company listed on these vials to ascertain how they procured these substances. Sophia slumped further against her pillows, her defiant spark extinguished. It wasn't meant to go this far, she whispered. Brian kept insisting. We just needed one more try. I advanced toward her bedside, my voice unwavering despite the tremor in my hands. Every time I fell ill, every meeting I missed, every client I lost, you were both there, meticulously noting how your poison was affecting me. What does that make you? The silence that followed was overwhelming. Outside, I could hear Brian being read his rights as additional officers arrived. Sophia lowered her gaze, unable to meet mine. Detective, I'm ready to give my formal statement now, I said, turning away from my sister-in-law. The trial stretched over 3 grueling weeks, though it felt like an eternity. I sat in the courtroom daily as the prosecution systematically presented their case against Brian and Sophia. The evidence was staggering, the vials recovered from Brian's office, the detailed records of each poisoning attempt, the recorded conversations, and text messages outlining their sinister plans. What struck me most was their demeanor throughout. Sophia, typically so poised and self-assured, appeared diminished in the defendant's chair, while Brian avoided my gaze. His eyes fixed on the floor. Expert witnesses detailed the potentially lethal effects of the compounds they'd been using. Dr. Collins's testimony was particularly damning. She provided a comprehensive analysis showing how the dosages had been incrementally increased over time, clearly indicating intent to inflict serious harm. A representative from the pharmaceutical company confirmed that Brian had illicitly obtained the compounds through a college friend working in their research division. The prosecution argued that the defendants had exhibited a calculated pattern of behavior. This wasn't merely corporate sabotage, the prosecutor declared in her closing remarks. It was a systematic effort to harm Mrs. Carter, a deliberate escalation that could have cost her her life. When the verdict was finally read, I felt neither joy nor vindication, only relief. Both Brian and Sophia were convicted on multiple counts, including attempted murder and conspiracy. The judge's words reverberated through the hushed courtroom. The premeditated nature of their actions against a family member, carried out over an extended period, warranted the maximum sentence. I watched as they were led away in handcuffs, contemplating how greed and envy had transformed two individuals I once trusted into unrecognizable monsters, sacrificing their business, reputations, and freedom in a bid to destroy me. A year after the trial, I stood at the podium of the Nashville Business Leaders Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The irony was not lost on me. This very opportunity had been the one Sophia had tried so hard to sabotage, fearing that the Watson account, which she and Brian had so desperately coveted, would elevate me to heights she could not tolerate. Instead, that account had spurred several additional major clients to sign on, establishing me as one of the region's foremost marketing executives. Success isn't solely about talent or hard work, I began, surveying the sea of attentive faces. It's about integrity, about forging genuine relationships built on trust. I paused, letting my words resonate. Sometimes, the greatest obstacles to our success come from those closest to us, but overcoming such challenges only makes us stronger. After my speech, numerous young professionals approached me for advice. One determined young woman, her eyes alight with hope, asked how I maintained my composure throughout the ordeal. I replied, I focused on what I could control. I gathered evidence, trusted my instincts, and refused to let fear impede my progress. Later that evening, I received an email from the Watson client confirming a 3-year renewal of our contract. I smiled, reflecting on how different things might have been if I hadn't trusted my gut that day at brunch. Meanwhile, the local paper had published a brief article that morning detailing Sophia and Brian's sentencing, but I paid it no heed. Instead, I immersed myself in preparing a proposal for my newest client project, aware that the best revenge was not about retribution. It was about moving forward and achieving success, despite those who tried to hold you back.